Dear friends, this is my second video on St. Paul. In total, I produced 3 videos which provide an introduction to St. Paul. In this specific video, I will firstly discuss the first missionary travel, then the second missionary travel, then the third missionary travel. I will then focus on an incident in Jerusalem and the final travel to Rome. I will briefly discuss about the possibility of a fourth missionary travel. I will then move the discussion on how biblical scholars present Paul. There will be a large section on the Pauline Corpus. In the description of this video, I will include the key moments of this presentation so that you can click and watch the parts that interest you. In the description of this video, I will also put the links for the other 2 videos where I provide the introduction to St. Paul. Paul did 3 missionary travels. In the first missionary travel, that dated 45 to 39 after Christ, Paul visited Cyprus and some regions of Asia Minor, what is modern-day Turkey. You can read that in Acts 13, chapter 13 and 14. During this time, Paul built different Christian communities with Barnabas. In 49, or in the beginning of year 50, Paul is in Jerusalem for the council. This is the first council of the church, and Paul and Peter are allies who tend to express the same idea in different ways. Generally, Peter and Paul agree with each other. If we read carefully the Acts of the Apostles, we will see that James oversees the council. However, Peter is not always sure of his decisions. Sometimes, in fact, similarly to Paul, Peter behaves as a modernist, but when he is alone without Paul, Peter seems to be a traditionalist. Paul, whom we can say is the cardinal, discovers this and criticizes publicly Peter, who we can say is the Pope. Read this in a letter to the Galatians, chapter 2, verses 11 to 16. Paul essentially says to Peter, you there in Jerusalem were agreeing with me, and now you behave exactly the opposite. The critique offered by Cardinal Paul to the Pope, Peter, has happened many times in the history of the church, and it is still happening today. Immediately after, Paul clashes with Peter in Antioch. In the second missionary journey, dated 50-52 after Christ, Paul visits Asia Minor, again present-day Turkey, and Greece. Have a read into Acts from chapter 15, verse 36 to chapter 18, verse 22. He sees again the communities that he founded in the first travel. During the second missionary journey, he meets Aquila and Priscilla, who have been previously expelled from Rome in the 40s, most likely in the year 49. Paul builds the community of Corinth. It is very likely that from Athens or from Corinth he writes the first letter to the Thessalonians. Paul also built the communities of the Philippians and of the Thessalonians. However, there is no doubt that Corinth will remain the most important community for Paul. As we already seen in the second half of 51 AD or in the first half of 52 AD, Paul appeared before Gallio. In the third missionary journey, Paul revisits Asia Minor and Greece. In his travels, he writes the majority of his letters, and the letters of Paul were in fact written in their travel, except, as we have already mentioned, the first letter to the Thessalonians. During the third missionary journey, he remains in Ephesus for 2 or 3 years. It seems that from Ephesus he writes 1 Corinthians, Galatians, and perhaps Philippians. Instead, it's very likely that from Macedonia he writes to Corinthians. It seems that during his 2 months staying at Corinth, he wrote the letter to the Romans. After having written the letter to the Romans, he plans to bring some money that he collected from different Christian communities. He wants to bring this money to the church in Jerusalem, which is in financial need. In Jerusalem, he escapes lynching. He's saved by the Romans. This is because some Jews accuse Paul to have profaned the temple because it brought inside a pagan. The centurion who was policing the temple's area imprisoned Paul, saving him from lynching. The Roman centurion discovers that Paul is a Roman citizen and he sends him to Caesarea, which was the political capital of the local Roman area. According to the Acts of the Apostle, he remains in Caesarea for 2 years. In Caesarea, Paul is presented to Antonius Felix, who hopes to receive a bribe in order to release Paul, but Paul doesn't have the money and he stays in prison. Paul then asks to Porcius Festus, who is the successor of Antonius Felix, to proceed with the prosecution. Otherwise, Paul will appeal to Caesar. In the end, Porcius Festus sends Paul to Caesar. There we have the travel by ship towards Rome, the shipwreck in Malta, and Paul's arrival in Pozzuoli. The Christian people of Pozzuoli brought him to Rome because he was a special prisoner in the sense that he didn't commit any crime. He only didn't follow some religious protocol in Judea, and this was a religious misbehavior rather than a crime, because in relation to this issue, there was an agreement between Jerusalem and Rome. Interestingly, Gallio was the brother of Seneca, who seems to have been the judge who condemned Paul. Thus, given he didn't do any crime, he had very good condition as a prisoner, and he was under house arrest, forced residence. Everything else comes from a patristic tradition. The fourth missionary travel to Spain is not documented historically. In fact, until the third missionary travel, all can be documented, but not the fourth travel. There is only one father of the church, namely Clement of Rome, also known as Pope Clement I, who did not know Paul and who did not know the direct testimony, who says that Paul, quote, reached the farthest limits of the West. This is in 1 Clement 5:7. This expression is often interpreted as Spain. Then, according to Clement, Paul came back and then he was killed as a martyr. Paul is perhaps killed under the Emperor Nero in the year 67 AD. Let us now discuss very briefly how biblical scholars have presented Paul. Classical interpretation, endorsed, for example, by Luther, has been the view of Paul who had a full conversion from Judaism, which he considered legalistic and completely detached from the idea of grace. This dichotomy is still present in the way in which some Protestant scholars, such as Karl Barth, have depicted the relationship between law and the gospel. This has influenced how we conceive the relationship between Christianity and Judaism. In this framework, Judaism risks to be completely disqualified. Last century, some scholars began to reinterpret these categories, recovering a vision of Paul who is more rooted in the Jewish reality in which he was living. For this reason, a so-called new perspective on Paul, NPP, has been proposed. In my book, entitled The Philosophical Theological Contribution of Ancients, I will put the link in the description, I discuss the NPP on pages 202 to 204. Please read these pages and let me know your opinion. Be very interested to know what you think. After that, we move to a so-called radical new perspective, which endorsed a relation of continuity rather than discontinuity between Judaism and Christianity at the time of Paul. Essentially, despite his encounter with the risen Christ, Paul does not renounce to his Jewish roots. We should recall that during Paul's time, Judaism was fragmented into many different currents. This plurality of forms of Second Temple Judaism helps to better understand the Apostle Paul. It is important to underline that Paul does not completely abandon the Jewish teachings.
Paul reworks some themes that were circulating during the second period Judaism. Paul writes using an apocalyptic style. We find this style, for example, in some writings in Qumran. In particular, in my articles 2 and 3, which are the appendices of a book that I'm currently writing, a book entitled The Way of the Word, an introduction to the letter to the Romans, I discuss the views of some scholars that have noted a similarity between Romans 7:17 and the Testament of Naphtali, and also between Romans 7:25 and 1QH. Both the Testament of Naphtali and also 1QH were found in Qumran. When I will publish this book, I will put a link in the description of this video so that you will be able to read about this.
Paul was a Jew who was formed at the school of Gamaliel, who in turn was a Pharisee. Paul lived in an Hellenistic context and was a Roman citizen. He goes to many synagogues and teaches there. However, the people in the synagogues do not welcome favorably his teachings. The main point is that he was a Messianic Jew who taught basically that Jesus of Nazareth, of whom he heard from those of the way, was truly the Messiah. Paul therefore recognizes Jesus as the Messiah who gives freedom to Israel, the Savior. Paul does not put in question the value of the Torah. He rather talks about sin, weakness as human being. For Paul, the divine salvation through Jesus is open to the pagans, but he hopes that Israel will eventually convert. Apart from the doubts on the Pauline chronology and the different interpretation of Pauline theology offered by many scholars, Paul was surely affected by the radical encounter with Christ on the way to Damascus. His personal encounter with Christ influenced dramatically the entirety of Paul's life until his martyrdom in Rome. When we deal with important historical figures, such as the figure of St. Paul, we must be careful to avoid projecting our vision and preconcept in the interpretation that we offer. Methodologically, it's very important to read carefully the biblical texts, then certainly place them in a certain historical environment. However, we should be careful not to insert too many interpretative keys which are external to the text we read, in order to avoid understanding the text with our vision and our preconcepts. I want to provide an example so that this is clear. If you will analyze carefully the 2018 movie Paul, the Apostle of Christ, you will see that the way Paul is dressed changed before and after his conversion on the way to Damascus. You will see that before he recognized the risen Jesus, he is wearing the typical Jewish dress and the hat, symbolizing his Pharisaic background as Saul of Tarsus. However, after his conversion, his clothing and appearance change to reflect his new role and mission as Christian apostle to the Gentiles. As can be seen in these pictures, Paul, after the conversion, has no longer the hat, which reflects the typical Jewish dressing code. This, in my view, is a misrepresentation of Paul, because Paul does not cut his Jewish roots after he encountered Christ. Let us now discuss the Pauline Corpus, which is the collection of the letters attributed to the Apostle Paul in the New Testament. These letters are Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy, Titus, Philemon, and Hebrews. These 14 letters, listed exactly in this order, are those that we currently find in the New Testament of all churches. A significant point is that in the history of the Church, this list has changed. The list shown above is the result of the canonization. The recognition of a canon is not an immediate process. In the history of the Church, there were different communities that had specific hermeneutical criteria and consequently reacted differently to various texts. Eventually, there was an integration and synthesis which provided a canon that has been transmitted until our days. First, we should not think a Pauline letter like a present-day letter, which most likely in our time is more likely to be structured as an email with a date, subject, and a signature. This is not necessarily what the ancients had in mind when they wrote and published an epistolary. The classic literature offers famous example which consisted of letters that were collected to preserve the thought, the figure, the biography of the author who was considered an important character to be remembered. Let us consider the epistolary of Plato, consisting of 13 letters. Notably, only one of these letters, the 7th letter, is original. The others are posthumous and are ascribed to Plato by a tradition that aimed to preserve Plato's teaching. The same can be said for Seneca's epistolary or the epistles of Cicero. Cicero even explained that he started to compose his edition, but then at a certain point he entrusted his work to one of his secretaries called Hiero and asked him to publish his letters. These letters present Cicero's perspective only in part, and they are the result from the editorial decisions of those who published these letters. So we can see how in antiquity the epistolary constitutes a way to present and remember the figure of a character considered relevant for his teachings. In relation to Christian literature, the letters of Paul are the first example of this genre. The genre of epistolary continues after Paul's death. For example, at the beginning of the 2nd century, Clement, the Bishop of Rome, wrote a letter to the Corinthians following the structure of Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Also, an important epistolary was attributed to Ignatian of Antioch. Paul's letters were written to be read in public for the whole church assembly and to be circulated. Paul writes the letter to the Romans not so much because he wanted to provide a theological opus, rather Paul wanted to present his thought to the Christian community in Rome, which did not know him, because he wanted to have a connection with them to subsequently prepare a missionary trip to Spain. Conversely, in the letter to the Corinthians, Paul wants to regulate some disciplinary issues in the community of Corinth. Paul writes his letter to present in some way not only a solution to specific problems, but also to express his thought, establishing his image in front of different Christian communities. Paul considers some Christian communities as reference point for the missionary activity towards other Christian communities. For example, the letter to the Romans, 1 Corinthians, and Ephesians are often seen as having a more general or universal scope, addressing broader theological and ecclesiological themes that transcend local issues. This contrasts with some of the other Pauline letters, which might focus more on specific local concerns or audiences. Specifically, there are two versions of the letter to the Ephesians. One version which addressed the Christians that are in Rome, Corinth, and Ephesus. Another version that does not refer to specific geographical locations of the Christian community, such as in Ephesus. We know that some letters were directly written or dictated by Paul. These are the so-called Proto-Pauline letters. Then there are the letters which Paul did not directly write or dictate, but were written by his disciples. And then there is the letter to the Hebrews, which is ascribed to a completely different theological school. The Proto-Pauline letters, the letter directly written or dictated by Paul, are the letter to the Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, the letter to the Galatians, the letter to the Philippians, the first letter to the Thessalonians, and finally, the letter to Philemon. These 7 letters represent half of the Pauline corpus of the present-day canon. We have previously seen that Paul wrote 1 Thessalonians in Athens or in Corinth during his second missionary travel, whereas he writes all the remaining letters during his third missionary travel. 1 Corinthians, Galatians, and perhaps Philippians were written in Ephesus, whereas 2 Corinthians from Macedonia. Instead, during his 2-month stay in Corinth, approximately in the years 56-57, he wrote the letter to the Romans. It's also interesting to note that some scholars have proposed that the canonical 1 and 2 Corinthians might be composite letters compiled from multiple letters that Paul wrote to the Corinthian church. This theory suggests that Paul wrote at least 4 letters to Corinth, which are now embedded within 1 and 2 Corinthians. It is possible that early Christians, possibly in Ephesus in the year 90 AD, combined and edited these letters, potentially rearranging and cutting text to create the 2 canonical letters we have today. This theory attempts to explain the abrupt changes in tone, topic, and style within 1 and 2 Corinthians. However, the exact process of compilation and editing remains hypothetical, and scholars continue to debate the specifics. Then there are 3 letters that, following specific stylistic criteria, have been attributed to Paul's disciples. These are the letter to the Ephesians, the letter to the Colossians, and the second letter to the Thessalonians. These 3 letters are so-called Deutero-Pauline letters, meaning that they were written after Paul by some authors that were following the Pauline school. We have then 3 pastoral letters, namely the letter to Titus, 1 Timothy, and 2 Timothy. These letters are relatively later writings which were probably written at the end of the 1st century. These texts contain ideas consonant with the Pauline school, but they face different problems such as the delay of the parousia, which is the second coming of Christ, and of other elements which were not originally dealt by Paul. Finally, we have the letters to the Hebrews. Already in antiquity, this letter was not directly ascribed to Paul because of his style and the type of Greek expression used in this letter. It is therefore a different letter. Already Tertullian says that this letter must have been written by Barnabas. Additionally, Origen explains that this letter is hardly Pauline. Today, biblical scholars agree that the letter to the Hebrews was not written by Paul, despite it entered the Pauline canon. The text of this letter resembles a sermon. Deutero-Pauline letters and pastoral letters are not less important than the Proto-Pauline letters in the canon. The pseudo-epigraphy in ancient times was common. Think, for example, about Plato's epistolary that I mentioned earlier. Even if some letters were certainly not written by Paul, they are still canonical. Pseudoepigraph doesn't mean falsification, but rather an attempt to preserve an important teaching with the objective to deal with new situation, which did not exist in Paul's time. Thus, not only the Proto-Pauline letters, but also the remaining letters that are not directly attributed to Paul, for example, the Deutero-Pauline and the Pastoral letter, are canonical and should be read and studied by the faithful because they are equally important. We know this because the second letter of Peter mentions Paul's letter. So also our beloved brother Paul wrote to you according to the wisdom given him, speaking of this as he does in all his letters. There are some things in them hard to understand, which the ignorant and unstable twist to their own destruction, as they do the other scriptures. This suggests that there was a Pauline corpus that was considered authoritative already at the time when 2 Peter was written, late 1st century to the mid-2nd century after Christ. In other words, it seems that there was a fixed canon already in the 2nd century after Christ. It is very likely that the communities which were evangelized by Paul transmitted these letters. According to Martian, the canon contained 10 Pauline letters. We have seen that now the canon contains 14 letters. In particular, the 10 Pauline letters referred by Martian did not include the pastoral letters and the letter to the Hebrews. Moreover, Marcion placed at the top of the list the letter to the Galatians rather than the letter to the Romans. This choice can be understood given Marcion's tendency to disqualify Judaism, especially when considering the Jewish theology of the law. However, Tertullian, who comments Marcion's texts, explained that the canon contained 14 Pauline letters, and therefore this list included the pastoral letters and the letter to the Hebrew, even though Tertullian attributed the letter to the Hebrews to Barnabas. We also have important witnesses showing a list of Pauline letters. In particular, there is an important papyrus called P46. This papyrus is also known as P. Chester Beatty II, which belongs to the Chester Beatty Papyri collection of papyrus found partly in Dublin and Michigan. The P46 is normally dated between 175 and 225 AD. The study of this papyrus is important because it displays a different order for the 11 Pauline letters that it contains. It seems that the pastoral letters are absent in this list, and it is strange that the letter to the Hebrews is located at the beginning, at the second place after the letter to the Romans. Perhaps they use the criteria of length to decide the order of the biblical manuscript. Another interesting witness is the Muratorian canon dated 2nd century after Christ. This canon explained what was considered canonical and what was considered non-canonical. The Muratorian canon contains 13 letters. The letter to the Hebrew is absent. The Muratorian Code also lists the non-canonical letters, such as the letter to the Laodiceans. This is most likely due to the fact that the letter to the Laodiceans was associated with Marcionism. And the Muratorian Code accepts Ephesians as canonical. However, Tertullian explains that Marcion's canon contained a letter to the Laodiceans. But Tertullian then explains that in reality this letter was the letter to the Ephesians. This demonstrates that there were different attributions for the same letter, and the Muratorian Code recognizes the letter to the Ephesians as canonical, but then also recognized the letter to the Laodiceans as non-canonical because it was Marcional. This shows that there were different attributions to various letters, and we can conclude that either Tertullian or the editors of the Muratorian Code misattributed or confused some biblical manuscript. The Pauline canon consolidates between the end of the 4th and 5th century. In particular, we have a letter from 367 after Christ, the so-called Athanasius 39th Paschal letter, that refers to the Pauline corpus, which lists the 14 Pauline letters that we still read today. The only difference is the position of the letter to the Hebrews. While now this comes at the end of the list after Philemon, in 367 after Christ, it came after 2 Thessalonians, before the pastoral letters. Apart from this difference, the canon then was the same as today's canon. The same can be said for Codex Sinaiticus. Then in the 5th century, the tradition stabilized the canon. The letter to the Hebrew is placed at the end of the list in most of the biblical manuscripts, and this order has been preserved until our time. Thus, the formation of a canon is an extremely complex process. Paul didn't want to write the Bible, but he wanted to say some things important for the Bible, in particular in his reference to the scriptures, the Old Testament, what they knew at that time, and their interpretation in light of the encounter with the risen Christ. The Pauline texts were considered important for the early church, and for this reason they were preserved and venerated. For this reason they entered the canonization process, that is, of recognition of what is considered sacred scripture and from which dogmatic statement can be derived.
I hope you enjoyed this video. I will put the links for the other 2 videos in which I provided an introduction to St. Paul. Please subscribe to this channel and like my video. It will help me to develop this project. See you the next time.